Welcome to Rethinking Communication. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we better connect with each other through the power of our words. For most of us, formal education left gaps in our ability to communicate well with each other, especially when trying to navigate conflict, inspire change, and overcome misunderstandings. I'm a former journalist, a speaking coach, and a communication expert, and my goal is to encourage you to rethink what it means to be an effective communicator, from the stage to the meeting room to the living room and everywhere in between. When I started this podcast back in the summer of 2020, back when it was named The Follow-Up Question, I set out and created this show because I wanted to hear people's stories. I wanted to bring people's stories to light in such a way that if we just heard people's stories with a little bit more complexity, with a little bit more nuance, that we might understand that we're not as divided as we appear to be, that we have a lot of common ground, that in many instances, our experiences are alike, not exactly alike, not perfectly aligned, but there are elements that we can take away from each other's stories that make us more relatable and connect us as human beings. And the conversation that you're about to hear is going back to those roots in a way. It doesn't have a ton to do with the renewed focus of this show, which is rethinking communication. We get into some of that, but this conversation with Mischa Zvegintzov is a look into someone's past and a look into someone's story that tells you the depth of who they are. We don't get into everything in Mischa's life, of course, but when you're talking about someone who got sober at 17, yes, I know that's crazy to say out loud, but you'll hear that story. When you talk about somebody who's got sober at 17 and the experience that and the perspective that situation has brought to their life, as you'll hear from Mischa, what it does to a person's emotions and their curiosity and how they go about helping others and showing up in the world can tell us a story that I think all of us can relate to. So without any delay, here is my conversation with Mischa Zvegintzov. You and I have some similarities and some things in common in that I've heard recently on a podcast that you did that you have done thousands of interviews. And I have done thousands of interviews. And I am just curious from somebody else who has done many, many, many of these types of interviews. Man, what do you enjoy about it? What is the thing that when you get into a situation where you're interviewing someone, what is that enjoyment? What is that process like for you?
You know what, Michael? I love that question. And what comes top of mind for me right off the bat, so I'm going to roll with it, is I'm a very curious person. And I have a very broad knowledge base. So super broad on lots of things, deep on a few, but super broad on a lot. And I'm curious, which I already said, and I love learning. So the interview process just gives me such an opportunity to delve into that curiousness and to learn and to oftentimes get validation on things that I think I know or to be challenged. Those are some of the things that are coming to me top of mind. Does that resonate with you or?
It does. And I've been thinking about curiosity lately because it has become a little bit of a buzzword, especially if you go on, for instance, LinkedIn, like, oh, be a curious person. And to me, being a curious person has to require some sort of an action and of some form of question asking, whether of yourself or whether of others. How do you define curiosity?
You know what? I love that. I'm going to roll with the I'm going to hold off on defining curiosity, but I want to address something that you said. If we're curious, our mind is going to be asking questions. Do I have the vulnerability or the willingness to ask the question? I think that's the key thing is to go,
Mhm.
okay, question came up. I'm willing to be vulnerable, show I don't know. perhaps be judged, throw caution to the wind. I've definitely heard over the years from friends, associates, business associates that I'm willing to ask the hard question. So, thinking on the lines of what is curiosity, there's some childish curiosity. Yes. So there's that kind of a thing. We got to be open-minded. I'm just rolling through the things that come to my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, gosh, we should almost have Webster's up and look up what is curiosity. I just like to know, I don't know if it's how things work, but I'm fascinated by, I'll answer it this way. I was in the home loan business for 15 years. And one of the things I loved about the home loan business is when you're interviewing somebody for a home loan, you need to know their credit history. So we get to pull their credit report, and credit reports tell you all kinds of good stuff, right? Like the dirt is in the credit report. You can't hide from the credit report. So that leads to all kinds of good questions. And being a home loan officer, and I need to get answers to these questions, gave me an excuse to dig deep on that kind of stuff. My whole life, I've been very fascinated by what people do for a living. And I think for me, I came out of the womb and it's been a journey my whole life. What am I going to do with my life? I have no doubt that when I'm on my deathbed and my two boys are there, and if I happen to have a partner at that time, I'll say literally 2 weeks before my death, I know what I'm going to do with my life. Right? I constantly feel like, what am I going to do with my life? And what is it? And so I would have friends. I had a brother, a stepbrother, Bobby, amazing, amazing man, came out of the womb. I'm going to be a scientist, and has just run with that and had variations in that journey. But a scientist, like a botanist type scientist, I think botanists are plants, but he liked lizards and all that kind of stuff. So whatever that kind of a scientist is, but he was on the front edge of gene splicing and all these things and
Mm,
DNA, and happened to be leading the forefront of that, but it just was from lizards and things like that. But anyway, always a little jealous of the person who seemed to know what they were going to do coming out of the womb. Like, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be an astronaut, I'm going to be a lawyer, I'm going to be a scientist, I'm going to be a movie star, whatever it is. And so home loans gave me, sorry, I'm going to turn on a fan in the background. It's kind of warm in San Diego right now. I'm
you're good.
I'm I'm I don't want to say suffering, but I'm suffering in in what's San in like in the beauty of the world. Whatever. Anyway, I'm going on a big tangent here. Uh so home being a home loan officer gave me an excuse to dive into what somebody does for a living. What do you do for a living? Like, I got to know your work history, at least a 2-year work history. I tended to deal with entrepreneurs, CEOs, CTOs, general managers, higher people up the food chain, let's say. So I just got to it fed that curiosity of, oh my gosh, you can do that for a living and you're making money doing that. Like, it was crazy. Anyway, there's a little bit. If that opens up any questions for you.
Oh, I got tons of questions, always. Okay, so you earlier in that answer said that part of curiosity is being willing to be vulnerable to ask the question, that just simply the act of asking the question, the implication behind it being, I don't know something. For you, Mischa, how do you feel that acceptable vulnerability came into your life? I'll call it acceptable vulnerability. I guess, how did you get good with being vulnerable in that implication that you don't know something, which I think a lot of us struggle with?
Great question. Again, how about this? My hand was forced. First, ego being out of control. In my youth, up until the last day of high school. I did horrible in high school and was not the best student as a young boy. Like I think a lot of us are. We're curious, but we have all this energy and we should probably be outside digging ditches versus inside in a room being, forced to think. It's like, I just want to dig a ditch. Like I want to make something or
Yeah.
break something or whatever we want to do, run up a hill or I don't know. Um,
Throw a rock off of a bridge and
throw,
see how big the splash
yes,
is.
there we go. Thank you. Yeah. So, so I was an addict and an alcoholic pretty much out of the gate. And I did horrible in high school and I was into drugs and drinking excessively in high school. I would have been, a druggie. Like when I was in high school, this is the 1980s. For anybody, it's funny. Now I'll say the 80s and the 90s. And if you're young enough, people go, 80s or the 90s? What are you talking about? I'm like, oh, 1980, 1990. Anyway, I was in high school in the 80s and we had the druggies, I can't remember what we called the students, but there was like the cliques, the druggies, the smart
All the
people, and the
clicks. Yeah.
jocks, whatever. And
Yeah.
and I contemptuously looked at the students who did well. I looked at them with contempt. I felt like they were brown nosing. I try to swear as little as possible, but excuse me when I swear, kissing ass, doing these sorts of
Yeah.
things. And, you know, in hindsight, that's what I wanted to be doing. I wanted to be thriving in that environment, but I couldn't because I was in this egoic, addictive alcoholic state. And so I graduate from high school. Coincidentally, the last day of high school, I get sober. Judge rank. I graduated to judge rank from Judge Horn. This is back in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And back then, you'd get Judge Horn was the mellow judge. He gave you 1 year probation, 2 year probation, 3 year probation. And then if you graduated to judge rank, you knew you were in trouble. And so judge rank gave me the choice 6 months in jail or go to treatment and get back on track. And had that moment of clarity of, man, I
Hmm.
see where my life is going if I stay on this dark path for whatever reason. That moment, judge rank, it's like it's time to get my life together. And I just tell you all that. So when it came time to finally go to college 4 years later, I was a snowboarder in Wyoming and a professional athlete for a number of years. And finally, after 4 years of doing that, it's like, all right, it's time to go to college. And I wish I could remember the counselor's name, but the counselor was like, sit at the front of the class. Okay, ask questions. Okay, study. Oh, okay, right. And one of the best things in the world that she told me was for every hour of class, study for 50 minutes and then take 10 minutes off. So if you do 2 hours of class, study 50 minutes, take 10 minutes off, whatever that formula was. And I was like, all right, I can
Mhm.
do that. But that's where it really started for me. I heard this counselor, I wish I could remember her name, but she was so profound. I would sit in class and I would have a question. And I was like, if I'm going to do good, if I want to get A's now instead of fail, I've got to ask the question. And so that's really where it started for me. Sorry for the long answer, but that's the truth of the matter. Looking at it, I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, yeah. Like I was sitting there in college and I was willing to challenge the professor and be challenged.
I've made reference on this show to a quote from John Maxwell that I love about why people change. John Maxwell says people change in 4 seasons: when they hurt enough that they have to, when they see enough that they're inspired to, when they learn enough that they want to, and when they receive enough that they're able to. And you absolutely went through that moment of hurting enough that you had to change. And I got to tell you, Mischa, it's wild to sit here across from somebody and say, and hear them say, I got sober at 17. Like, that's a wild thing to just like have come across my ears right now. Big question for you in all that. Man, what got you to that point? How does a kid get to the point where you, like you said, resented the successful kids, dove into the world of drugs and alcohol? We have previously had a conversation for the people listening where you told me you've approached life where instead of being angry, and I'm assuming some of that anger comes in those moments as a kid, that you show up with love. Man, what led to that? What led to that where we're having a conversation about you being sober at 17?
It's crazy, right? I lose track of that. Thank you for shining a light on that. I act like it's normal. And I act like it's no big deal. And it isn't. And I have no attachment to it. And I can talk about it freely, which is
Yeah.
beautiful,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah. So I grew up middle class, Jackson, Wyoming. Father was a lawyer, mother was a stay-at-home mom. On the outside, everything looked really shiny and great. However, my mom was a bad, bad alcoholic, and I say this with an open heart and love, and no resentment, just the reality of life. Where she grew up in Germany, was born right before World War II in Germany. Her father was, I think it was a captain in the German army who died on the Russian front.
Mm,
She grew up with post World War II atrocities. We don't talk about this a lot, too much, but people who lose wars usually is pretty gnarly after the war is lost. There's
oh, yes.
usually lots of atrocities going on. So she grew up in that environment, came to the States in the mid 60s when she met my father, but she had went through stuff that I wouldn't wish on anybody. Cope, maybe she turned to alcohol, and I don't even know the whole story.
Sure.
So anyway, that alcoholic life was modeled to me by my mother. My father was relatively successful. Drinking was a normal part of life. Throw some drugs in there. Both of them died sober, by the way. But
Mm,
what I'm trying to say is that was what was modeled for me, which is not an excuse, but when you're in that fire, and then my mother would literally disappear for years at a time, and then my father was sort of a dark soul,
mm,
shall we say.
mhm.
I'm not sure if there was hope of a normal childhood. Where am I trying to go with this without sounding blamey? But anyway, it's I just the natural path was alcohol and drugs. So already when I was 14, 15 years old, I was deep in it. The rest of the story is my mother tried to get sober when I was 9 or 10 years old. So I got educated on what it meant to be an alcoholic. My father got sober when I was 13 years old, I believe, 14 years old, and stayed sober and died sober with decades of sobriety.
Mhm,
So then recovery was modeled for me.
mm,
So they planted the seeds of recovery. So they planted the seeds of addiction initially, but then they planted the seeds of recovery, which is a gift.
oh, for
And so
sure.
when I'm 13, 14, 15, 16 years old and just going deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole, and how do I want to say it? I started drinking and drugging, knowing that I shouldn't, swearing I wouldn't be like my parents or that wouldn't happen to me. And there's a term called denial that is thrown around in the the recovery circles or the addiction circles. The worse it got, the more in denial I became. So I went
Mhm,
knowing I probably shouldn't do it because I saw what it did to my family, to being deep in it, going to jail, all this stuff going on, middle class violence, you know, girlfriend dies in a drunk driving accident. I wasn't driving, but like things like this are going on. And I remember too, as a youth, I did not like my emotions at all. I
Mm.
did not like the fact that I had these emotions. I tended to be more emotional on the emotion curve. So so I tried to and became successful at suppressing my emotions. And I remember when this girl I was dating, Sandy was her name, died in this car accident. And I remember being completely numb to it. I was 16 years old, and I had this complete moment of clarity of I'm numb and it's not good.
Yeah.
Like this is not healthy.
Yeah.
And where am I going with all this? What was the sorry, I'm just as I'm reliving some of this, I'm you're giving me an opportunity to process. Thank you. What question was I answering? And then I'll get
Well,
back on track with the story.
yeah, I was curious how a 17-year-old gets sober and what led to that.
Yeah, yeah, cool. I'll go on. Yeah. So there you go. So that's sort of the thick of it. You'd think that at 16 somebody dies in a drunk driving accident that would straighten somebody out. That was not enough. Other things were happening, and each time I would have this moment of clarity of, yeah, I probably shouldn't drink. My father was sober and he's like, yeah, you probably shouldn't drink anymore. So I went down this rabbit hole of trying to constantly prove that I wasn't an alcoholic, I wasn't an addict, that I could control my drinking, that I could control my drug use. And I was constantly failing, quitting all the time, starting again, quitting. I'd literally get out of jail. That's it. I'm done. I'm going to be sober. By the end of the next day, I was going out to have a couple of drinks with my friends, and I tried all the stuff. I'd go to different states. Like I ended up in jail in Idaho because I was supposed to be in court in Wyoming, and was like, if I go have a couple beers in Idaho, that'll solve the problem. Location will solve the problem. And I just tried it all at such a young age. And you'll hear this term in the recovery communities or the 12-step communities, being spiritually bankrupt, mentally bankrupt, physically bankrupt. Like I was already at 17 years old, physically pretty beat up, 150 pounds, 6'2", living on pretzels, cheddar cheese, and apple juice, and mentally exhausted and already spiritually bankrupt. And I think that's the key thing. I was already
Yeah.
spiritually, mentally bankrupt. The seeds of recovery had been planted in my life by my parents. And so that little nudge from the judge, I like to call it, sort of everything came together in a positive way in that moment. Like it doesn't have to be like this. I can change. There's like you said, I can now start living through the lens of love versus darkness. And to have that happen at 17, what a gift. And it's been straight line sobriety for me ever since. But does that answer the question? I think it should.
It does. And I promise this is not a therapy session, but I'm going to set up my next question with what you just said like this. One of the things that I notice in how we communicate with each other is we often turn to a suppression or numbing of our emotions, especially when we disagree. Or we experience it at the other end of the extreme, that our emotions become so overwhelming that our communication breaks down. We're the worst form of ourselves when we are overly emotional and try to communicate across disagreement or conflict. And so we often live in this false duality of choice where we either have to numb our emotions or be at the extreme of our emotions. And so my question in that setup is, you referenced earlier that curiosity and being willing to be vulnerable about what you don't know. I'm curious, Mischa, when did you begin to explore with that curiosity the role that your emotions had or had not played in your life up to that point? After getting sober, after going into your recovery program, after going to college and getting that advice from that counselor, was there ever a moment where your curiosity turned towards your emotions and the role that those emotions play?
I love that. subconsciously, I grew up in Wyoming, more conservative, pull yourself up from your bootstraps type of mentality,
I'm from Kansas, so I heard that all the time.
right? Yes, and father was a mountain man, so he may have spoke to emotions, but he was a river guide, lawyer, hunter, mountain climber. There wasn't a lot of soft fuzzy emotions flying around, is what I'm trying to say. He did the best he could. Thanks, Dad.
Yeah, yeah.
But but part of the 12-step modalities for sure are trying to not let your emotions drive you or drive you to drink or drive you to drug. And how do we manage our emotions and things like that? Fear, anger being the key drivers. In some of the 12-step literature, it talks about pause when agitated, pause when doubtful, try and connect with your God, your higher power, the universe, call it what you will, to give you that space to not overreact. So it's kind of the foundation that I'm playing in my youth. However, I was very competitive, did want to win, was a pro snowboarder, wanted to be the best at school, wanted A's when I finally got to school. And then when I graduated from school and got into the professional side of things, I wanted to be number one. A lot of zero sum game mentality.
Mhm.
So, on the one hand, I'm playing in this pause when agitated, trust in God, patience, love, tolerance messaging. On the other hand, I'm still super, 6'2" male, young, cocky, arrogant, as I'm supposed to be by design, by genetic design. I'm giving you a long answer, but
It's
I think
okay.
it'll come
It's
together
okay.
here if you hang in there with me. So I think in my youth, through my 20s, I was learning how to start to deal with my emotions subconsciously, or I wouldn't even have known it. But at the same time, it'd be like, pull yourself up from your bootstraps, fix the problem, this kind of thing. Finally, I was, I think for a while, I was still suppressing more emotions than I was letting out. And the question was, when did I start consciously, curiously looking at my emotions? I believe is what the question
Yes.
you asked me was. So I'm getting there. Yeah.
Yeah.
In my 30s, yeah, in my 30s, I finally was like, oh yeah, I am emotional. I've got kids now. I don't want to be yelling at my kids. I've got a wife. I need to learn how to healthily deal with my emotions as more stressors are around me. It's easy to deal with your emotions when you're solo because there's less triggers, right? If you're out there dating or single, like all you got to do is you can just break up or whatever. If you've got a wife and kids and career, then there's lots of pressure points. So I was like, oh yeah, I need to find healthy ways to deal with my emotions. So through my 30s, I believe that I finally was letting out as many emotions as I was taking in. And then I hit my 40s, my parents die in rapid succession. Divorce, parents die, what I like to call the death, divorce, failed relationship years. So up until then, after I get sober, I really pretty much know nothing but success,
Mhm.
right? I have marginal success as a professional snowboarder, which sets me up for great success in college, which sets me up for great success in sales because I've got great mentors and I'm following instructions and things like that. But then divorce, career goes completely sideways. Both my parents die in rapid succession. Another failed relationship. And it was like the cap was ripped off the bottle of my emotions,
Hmm.
and I could no longer keep them in. That level that I was at, universe was like, guess what? You get to actively learn how to deal with and process with your emotions because they're coming out. And I think this happens to a lot of us when we hit our 40s, midlife crisis. Universe forces our hand. Our identities get shocked by something. Sometimes it happens to people younger in life or
Mhm.
older in life or whatever. But I think there's a general arc of life that we're following. And in our 40s, parents might start dying, career upheaval, divorce, all these things. Emotions start coming out like in a big way. I was like, oh no. I was like, maybe I do need a counselor. Where before I was like, pull yourself up from your bootstraps. People who get counselors are weak, right?
Mhm. Yep.
I hate to even say that now, but it's true. I
That's
might have been a little bit arrogant back in the day. um, and to try to close the loop on this question, of your question of when did I start consciously, curiously looking at my emotions? That was really it because I was like, these emotions are coming out. Had the moment of clarity, you got to figure it out. And I don't want to fall into the pill mill of the industrial medical complex or call it what you want, right? Like the whole corporate nature of pill prescriptions now is freaking insane, in my humble opinion. I mean, some people need some pill support along the way, but generally speaking, I'm going to say our country is completely overprescribed and overmedicated. Being sober for however many years at this point, and again, I've stayed sober, was like, I need to deal with my emotions and I need to deal with it without pills because I
Yeah.
kind of cashed in the ticket. And that was the key thing. I was like, I will do everything in my power to not jump on the antidepressants, the SSI inhibitors, all these things, all these names. And so it was like, all right, I got to meditate now, like legit meditate. I got to legit start journaling. I've got to legit level up my prayer routine. I've got to legit stop trying to fill the God size hole with anything other than God or the universe or call it what you will. Right. So perhaps I was dating a lot and philandering around or compulsively needing validation from women or people. Uh, these sorts of things. That's I very curiously started looking at them right up over here. I've got A Course in Miracles. It's like someone had handed me this book, A Course in Miracles,
Mm.
which is like leveling up acceptance and letting go and freeing yourself of judgment. So I started actively like, all right, like what's the word judgment mean? Judgment was a superpower for me for a while. Like I could judge you. I'm a good judge of character. I can size you up quick and know whether you're good or bad or what are your intentions. That zero sum game mentality, all that stuff had to start going away. And I started curiously, consciously looking at that. Hopefully, I answer your question there.
I'm yes, and I'm very interested in the remaining time we have left here. You've mentioned the 12-step program, that modality of sobriety. You've mentioned ego reduction or hinted at it. To me, it all kind of falls under this bucket of looking inward and becoming more self-aware. Is that mm, is that how you approach this, or is that how you would label this as a self-awareness game?
Yeah. Yep. I think, and there's two components of it. I think there's self awareness and action, because I think the self awareness in itself will not serve us, and it's a futile rabbit hole to go down because you can start falling into victimhood, all these sorts of things.
Mm,
So self aware, but action. So part of the 12 step modalities and the ego reduction are summed up in trust in God, clean house, work with others. When we're in that addictive state, we're extremely selfish and it's all about us. And it's self will run riot. And I have no capacity to see that I am completely selfish in every circumstance times 1,000. So, the 12-step modalities are like, hey, man, there's something else that's important in the universe other than your own thinking, right? Like maybe you're not the center of the universe. So it's like trying to find that source, that higher power. Clean house is that inventory, that self-reflection that you're talking about. I think was the term you used, or something like that is what
Right.
we're
Yeah.
talking about here.
Yeah.
And then it's like the cleaning house of that, though. I need to inventory how I'm acting, what I'm doing, what I'm thinking. And if I see holes in that, I need to go out and, in effect, clean up those relationships where perhaps I overreact. I had to go back to my kids and be like, yo, kids, especially a teenager. I went to my teenage son, Cooper, at the time he was a teenager. And I'd like done this self reflection. And I was like, man, I prejudge everything he says. I assume the worst. I cut him off when he's talking, all this stuff. I was a good dad, but if we look at it, we can all find areas where there's rough edges. And who wants to go to their teenage son and apologize for these things, right? Because it's almost like handing them the sword,
Yeah.
right? Like here,
Yeah.
but anyway, I was like, hey, Cooper. Again, I'm giving you a very long answer, but hey, Cooper, man, I tend to prejudge what you say. I cut you off when you're talking. I assume the worst oftentimes. I don't hold space for your opinion. I rush to judgment. Like, I am sorry and I am going to change. So there's this accountability piece of that. And then help others. It's like the service side of things. The biggest thing in my life is how can I be of service? What can I bring to the table? And there's this page 102 on this one of the 12 step, it's called the big book, where it basically says you can go anywhere and do anything as long as your motives are correct and you have a service mindset, in effect what it says. And so literally when I read that, 17 years old, that little prayer dropped in and I was like, oh my gosh, how can I be of service? What can I bring to the table? Before I jumped on with you here, how can I be of service? What can I bring to the table? And so that's what I mean. We can self-reflect, but we gotta take action on it.
Mhm.
Yeah?
Yeah. To loop it back to what we were talking about at the beginning and the fact that you've done thousands of interviews, and I'd love some context of how those interviews took place. What were you doing for those? But maybe perhaps a leading question here. I know I look at it this way in what you just said. I look at me asking questions of others as an act of service to them, to help them get out of their mind what they're feeling, what their experiences have been, what their perspective is in a way that I might not understand. That's an act of service of asking a question of somebody and having it truly be curious. I'm curious what context of all your interviews and your questions, what's the context of that? And do you see it the same way?
Yeah, boy, man, I just love your questions. And when I got into home loans, I was ready to be successful and I was ready to have success. So I found everybody in the home loan business who was successful and I interviewed them. Literally was like, how did you do it? I need to know how to do it so I can
Yeah.
implement myself.
Yeah.
And what a cool thing to give people an opportunity to be of service and mentor, right? They're
Yeah, and
like,
we
"Oh,"
just
and
like
when
talking about ourselves too. So
thank you, right? And they're like, and I was a truly captive, interested audience.
yes.
So there were those types of interviews going on. Like we wouldn't call that like an interview like this, but I literally
Sure.
was like, I need some time with you to ask you about how you built your business so I can try and learn from you. Um, where else was I going? When I left mortgages, was a yoga teacher for a while, reemerged as a single stay-at-home dad. The universe was like, you have to leave the mortgage business, and your only option is to be a stay-at-home dad to your boys. And I was like, no, anything but that. My identity. Anyway, so I'm getting done being a single stay-at-home dad. Boys graduate, going off to college, reemerge 5 years ago into the online marketing space and wanting to be able to be successful in the online marketing space because I love entrepreneurship. I love sales. I love marketing. I just love it. I'm good at it. Asking questions and being curious serves us in that
Absolutely.
arena
Yes, it does.
as well. Yeah. So that cycle started again for me of, man, if you're an entrepreneur having any sort of success or were a few steps in front of me, I was grabbing you and interviewing you. Like, how do you do it? What do you do? What's this? What's an avatar? What's that? Talk to me. And just going deep and having conversation after conversation. Next natural progression was to start an official podcast and like interview people and get a
Yep.
publish it. Right. And so hopefully I'm answering your question. I think I have been.
Yeah. And I asked a two-part question, which is actually one of my no-nos, but do you feel like it's an act of service to somebody else to be curious about them? Was the second part there.
Yes, I do. I do. I do. I do. And I think it gives somebody time to self reflect as well and to
Yeah.
solidify their argument or to paint the picture or to process their own stuff, whatever that is. Like you're giving somebody a platform to put words to what they're thinking, feeling, and doing. And that can be very, very powerful, especially if we take what they're giving us and use it. I mean, how that like that's the ultimate act of service, right? I think.
Use it how? That's I think I like that framing there. If we take what they're giving us and use it, how? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So in the online marketing space, there's two ways to use it. One is to literally take what they're giving me that they've offered me of here's how you can have success with it. So I go apply it in my life on my daily actions and use what they've so freely given to me to help me build, grow, mature, monetize, whatever. I think the other side of the coin too is as I'm a more mature man now, more mature human, I think being a man's got nothing to do with it. So whether if you're a woman listening to this, take it in too, is that I used to internalize. I'm more discerning. I would internalize something that somebody said as the truth. Now I can go, oh, maybe what you said is valid in your life, but I don't need to internalize that as truth to me. But thank you for that great nugget.
Mm.
But mm, I'm going to not take action on that consciously. How about that? So, like, have a discerning ear, a discerning eye. I think when we're excited about something or, in that momentum, it can be like, oh, yeah,
Or
that's the
perhaps
truth. That's the
perhaps
truth.
emotional, to use our phrasing from earlier, perhaps emotional.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. And we can internalize something as true to our detriment. I just heard somebody speak. I was at a speaker meeting, a recovery speaker meeting, and somebody had long-term sobriety decades, and they were older than me. Let's say they're in their 60s, pushing their 70s. And they said, so we look at that and go, oh, this guy must know what he is saying is the truth. And he said, yeah, now stuff will come up from the past where I think that I might owe an apology or something, but I don't think it's worth worrying about or I need to take action on it because what's it worth bringing up old stuff? I.e., I'm going to die soon anyway, so why bring it up and
Mm,
dredge up the past?
mm.
And I was like,
Yeah.
yeah, I can internalize that as the truth, which might be for some people, but for me, I was like, no, 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 no. If stuff's bubbling up in my conscious that I haven't dealt with or cleaned my side of the street on or done some inventory on it or something like that, I need to look at it, and I might need to clean house. I might need to call somebody from 40 years ago and be like, "Yo, I was not cool back then. I am sorry." Anyway, another little tangent.
Yeah, no, totally fine. Just to recap, those 3 steps from, or those 3 outlines from the 12-step process that you shared, is it, do I have this right? Take inventory, clean house, and then take action? Were those the 3? Or correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep, that's a version of it. So trust God, clean house, work with others. The work with others
Gotcha.
is be of service. So we would just say trust God, clean house, work with others, and work with others is being of service. And so
Love it.
clean house
Love
is
it.
that inventory, right? Yeah, yeah, good.
Yeah, awesome. Mischa, last question for you here. What's a question that you wish you were asked more?
Ooh, what's a question that I wish I was asked more? I will try to say this non-egoically, but it's what's coming up, and I tried just to roll with what's coming up. I hear a lot, you're shiny. I glow. You're happy. You have this presence about you. These kinds of things, that love, leading with love is self-evident. I don't have to tell you. You meet me or see me or talk to me, generally speaking, you're going to feel that vibe. And I'm surprised you don't hear more like, how do you get there? How do you do that? Or
Hmm.
how does that happen?
Well, I appreciate that you've shared some of that today in this conversation. I think we've probably just scratched the surface, but we went to some places that I wasn't even sure we would go. So, uh, thank you for kind of giving us a path to that, to giving us a path and a perspective on reducing that ego and being more self aware, Mischa. I appreciate your perspective on this. So, thank you so much.
Yeah, indeed, pleasure. And this has been a ton of fun. And man, I've got to share good stuff and good insights. So I appreciate that and love your questions. So thank you for the space,
Thank,
the
of
curiousness in
course.
the space.
Thank you, sir. Many thanks to Mischa for joining me on this episode of Rethinking Communication and sharing his story, going to some vulnerable places with me. If you found value in the conversation that you just heard between Mischa and me, please share this episode with your network and help me get this show out to more ears, to more people. If you're at all interested in working with me as your speaker or leadership communications coach, or if you're interested in the speaking and communications workshops that I do, perhaps you're looking at some workshops to bring into your company in 2025 in the early part of the year, please reach out to me. You can go to my website at michaelashford.com and connect with me there, find more information there. You can also sign up for my newsletter, The Follow-Up, where I'm sharing my thoughts and actionable takeaways on how to become a better communicator. You can go to michaelashford.com/newsletter and sign up there. And if you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@rethinkingcommunication.com or reach out on the website. That's it for this episode of Rethinking Communication. And until next time, keep asking questions.